So, I am what they call an environmental economist, thinking that some of you never heard the term before. I have studied economics and I got extremely interested in what's outside the markets and what makes people happier, healthier, as well as wealthier, and how to use the tools of economic analysis and finance to a certain extent to make sure that our decisions are much better informed and not limited to flows of money alone. So the kind of things that I try to measure are very much obvious things to you, and probably what makes you design these spaces and want to keep them up. But that's not always the case, that those who make funding decisions are as enthusiastic about the health and wealth, happiness impacts of green spaces. I'd like to propose that if we want to maintain open spaces, green spaces, that we need to change them from being seen as cost items to being seen as investments. Investments in public health through green space, investments including mental health, investments in economic productivity, investments in the value of other assets, like values of property, for example. And to be able to do that, I think we need to learn a couple of things about finance and a couple of things about economics, and I'm here to suggest what they might be. One of the limitations of finance, especially finance about open spaces, is the way that the value of open spaces are accounted in the local authority accounting books. The protocol is to value assets at their resaleable value. And if a local authority cannot sell this park for development, its value included in the account as £1. Some of the parks we love and we know we benefit are only accounted as valuing £1, a nominal value, whereas the cost of maintaining those places are counted to the last penny, and very accurately. So in the negotiations about budgets, especially in times of austerity, parks become a cost item, whereas they are not. In fact, one of our very first local authority clients made the turnstile point that you made, Nicola, and he said, well, the swimming pool gets more money or gets the money easier because they have a turnstile, and he can come to these meetings with Excel sheets. And can make a better point than I can for my park. I said, well, I'm an economist, I can give you more Excel sheets than you want. And some really badly drawn graphics and no photographs whatsoever. The other thing that we need to learn about is, so we need to change that. We need to change that £1 to something bigger that we know it is. We may not be able to get to the exact figure. We may not be able to value every benefit of parks and green spaces in monetary terms, but we know for sure that it is more than £1. So what are economists interested in? We're interested in the impacts of green spaces on health, wealth and happiness, and I'll give you examples of how we then quantify them in monetary terms. But we need to return back to finance and accounting, because economists are good at giving you evidence, but they don't have the money to invest in usually. It's the finance people you need to then speak again to convince them to part with some of their budget or invest in, if they are philanthropic investors, for example, or even more and more, hard-nosed, what used to be hard-nosed, city investors. So we need to follow the money. As people say. So let me give you some examples of how we've used this accounting and financing models in quantifying the benefits of maintaining and keeping places, designing and keeping places, it should say, using the two case studies, one in London Borough of Barnet. Peter and I collaborated with John Sheaf in Barnet, and we collaborated with Countryscape, a landscape planning organisation, and environmental finance for Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So let me give you some examples. What kind of benefits? Well, there's a lot of medical evidence and a lot of epidemiological evidence that says active physical exercise in open spaces in particular versus gyms reduce risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases and others. And it's a much more socially equal access to green space as opposed to paying obviously gym memberships and then not going as well. Also, we know that green spaces, trees improve air quality. Planted in the right places, they can reduce noise levels, and they have health benefits to do with respiratory diseases and various noise affects sleep patterns, and sleep deprivation causes diseases, especially in urban centers. We also know that spending more time in nature could improve mental health, could speed up recovery from mental health problems, and also prevent mental health. There's of course the linkages between these things. Green space and health outcomes are not perfect, and they're not transferable to everywhere, but there is a lot of evidence. There is national guidance as well. How do we measure these in economic terms? We look at increases in economic outputs. Every less sick day you spend is increased economic productivity. It sounds very mercenary to have that on the top bullet point, but that's, use me for that kind of evidence, and we also have to make other types of arguments. Of course, we can, if we avoid illness, we avoid the need to treat that illness, and we can avoid NHS costs. But it's not just about the money we spend. People don't want to have the pain and suffering of ill health, and in many cases they'll be willing to pay more in their council tax if they knew that the money was spent to keep these places and return to them as better health. What we have is the evidence to be able to measure these things. What we are now more and more building is a financial mechanism to turn evidence into actually cash from different budgets. Another type of benefit is recreation. So I may just want to go and sit in a bench and enjoy the weather, the peace and quiet. I may not actively do active exercise. You can see I don't really do much active exercise, but I live very near a park, and I enjoy that, and I go there all the time. Sometimes I spend money in the cafes, and if I had a car, I would park it somewhere, but I don't. But I'm also, again, I'm willing to pay towards the maintenance of that park if I'm asked, perhaps much more so than many other things that the council spends money on. It's not just about people, the benefits, it's also about managing our environment. So a lot of the parks could be used, or other sustainable urban drainage systems, green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, whatever the term you want to use, can reduce flood risk. How do I measure the benefit of reducing flood risk? I can look at the avoided flood damage. There are huge manuals. It's called multicolored manual. You probably use it, or you used it in the past. That's about the physical damage to buildings. But it's not just about physical damage. It's also about health and well-being impacts of not being flooded. But also we can avoid property level investment in reducing flood risk. And finally, greener places attract more businesses and more people to an area. In fact, again, one of the first local authority work we did was actually commissioned by the economic development of the local borough rather than the director of open spaces. And because he said it's Havering, in fact, and had an enormous green asset base, but wasn't known for that. It was known for actually their environmental website for their environmental management had a factory stack putting out pollution when there isn't even a factory in that borough. Why not make more use of the green infrastructure? And of course what that does is that increases property values for good reason. rather than speculatively. So what we do in the natural capital accounting, and we can discuss what natural capital is if you want to later on, is to put all this information together to change that £1 figure to something else. So we start by saying which assets does the local authority have, so what parks, what open spaces, street trees, where are they, how big are they, and what do they do for us, so what benefits do they provide, some of the list that I mentioned, but other things as well. Who are the beneficiaries? And I think that goes back to what Nicola was saying, both who are they in terms of engaging with them and the management side, of course, but more so for us, which one of those beneficiaries would be willing to contribute to the upkeep of these places. It's very important to identify and know who you're dealing with, and what kind of returns do they get, what kind of benefits do they get. So everyone very easily accepts that we might save NHS money, but there isn't a system within which NHS can pay for preventative medicine through investing in parks. And it's changing slowly, and there are people who are in local authorities, joining with their peers, directors of public health, directors of open parks, and negotiating together rather than against each other, and also case of Newcastle, etc., that previous speakers mentioned. We also want to look at maintenance costs, and that's the easiest bit of data to find. As I said, it's kept. But there are lots of gaps and opportunities you can identify in the accounts, and sometimes the actually financial accounts lumped together, so you don't exactly know how much you're spending for what outcome. So there's a little bit of analytical work to be done there. So we've done this for one of the places we've done it is Barnet. I've never worked for local authorities until 2-3 years ago, really, because nobody wanted my services, and I was very pleasantly surprised that we can now do this. I think the reason is that they could see the strategic importance of having this kind of analysis. Are these numbers correct? Well, they're not wrong. They are definitely incomplete. I survived this work knowing that these numbers are not zero, and I can prove that they are not zero and they are useful. But we can't value everything. We can't value social things, sense of space, belonging, stewardship of environment. There are loads of other arguments you have to make. This is just one way of arguing for placekeeping. Thanks to John Sheaf's leadership and Peter's contributions, we won. The whole team won a Landscape Institute award for this account. That's nice for the ego, but what's much more important is that using this evidence, John and colleagues were able to raise almost £1 million for the borough for the upkeep of these parks. They would have raised some of that money, I'm sure, without this evidence, but I think it has made it easier and quicker to make an argument in favour. We've also done something like this in Manchester. Now, metro mayors are interesting because they not only have the political power, but they also have the budget control, both the health and the open spaces. So what we're looking in Manchester, we've done the same accounts with other partners. We looked at what assets there is in Manchester, what kind of land cover they have, what kind of benefits that kind of that land cover provides for the city population of Manchester. I hope that the symbols are kind of self-explanatory, but there's lots of improvements due to air quality improvements, noise improvements, active engagement in recreation, etc. These numbers don't come from primary research. If they did, it'll be very expensive research. We use what's in the literature, what's in the medical required guidelines, and what's in the economic literature, and we do our best. What has come up, and this is my penultimate slide, I'll skip a few, is an investment plan from Manchester. I only got one copy, but you can download this. This is the first investment plan of its kind. It is, if you can say, investment plan. It's called Natural Capital Investment Plan, but it is making and keeping places. And this identifies different beneficiaries and different kinds of projects. The other thing that we need to really learn I can do that. There are some photographs. Um, um, the thing that we need to learn is that how to make a project like this investable by many parties. How to make it investable, how to identify that a project that you would have done anyway, what kind of benefits it would generate for whom, and how can you bring them to the table. And for that, we need to become multilingual. We need to use different metrics, we need to use different terms, and we need to be able to do that at the same time and empathize with each party that will come to the table. The kind of things that we looked at is this is just a prioritization exercise for Manchester. It doesn't mean that this quadrant of activities are always top priority. It's just for Manchester. But basically, what's most investable soonest, that was the priority. Not necessarily the highest benefit, but what can we start doing very quickly, set leadership, and have following. And the things that came up are these 3 finance models. So sustainable urban drainage is nothing new. You designed them already, but here the finance thing new is to agree that if you reduce the volume of water entering the public sewage system, you get paid for doing that. And what we need to next do is actually find, and United Utilities have been involved, as the local water company, make it possible for United Utilities to pay towards this kind of thing, or forego connection fee. Now, for that, the water regulator needs to give permission, Environment Agency, DEFRA needs to give permission. So hopefully the mayor's leadership, that might happen quicker. Place-based models is like the trust that Peter mentioned in Newcastle, to do the same in Manchester. And carbon and habitat banks is a bit like, I think in a previous session here, they were talking about the offsetting and net gain, and you could buy credits. But you can't do that very much. It'll turn into your sporadic events, fundraising, if offsetting markets, if carbon credit markets are not regulated, if they're voluntary, that you can't rely on them. So that's it. Thank you very much.